Right, what I'm going to try and do is give you an overview of the contribution made by the British Armed Forces during the Korean War. Forgive me if I'm saying to some of you information you might already know. First, this slide shows a member of the Royal Artillery standing on the 38th parallel in 1952 or 1953. That's not primarily the reason I'm showing it. The reason I'm showing it is a lot of the veterans I've spoken to over the years, especially national servicemen, many of them sadly no longer with us, they always describe Korea as when they remember it as a 19 or 20-year-old lad, as a barren place, or some even say a god-awful place. A barren place, so when you see a photograph like that, you can get an inkling of what they're talking about. Now, just a few facts about the Korean War, and I know some of these have been kindly mentioned already. Approximately 80 to 110,000 British service personnel were involved, and that's at least 60,000, if not 80,000, from the British Army. These men and women fought as part of the United Nations Command, which was the body set up in July 1950 to orchestrate the international military response to the Korean War on behalf of the United Nations. It's perhaps salutary to note that Britain maintained a military presence in Korea until the late 1950s, upholding the ceasefire. And we've talked a bit about this already, but the war was fought against the backdrop of global Cold War. Now, there's an excellent book, a general history by the late Colonel Michael Hickey, himself Korean veteran, and he talks about the Korean War being viewed at the time as a centrally orchestrated plot on behalf of the Kremlin. We now know that's not necessarily entirely accurate, but at the time that's very much always seems to me how it was perceived by people in the West, and including the soldiers who were sent there. Talking about the British Armed Forces, I'd like to start with the senior service, the Royal Navy. Throughout most of the war, a light fleet carrier like this one, I think this is HMS Triumph, if I remember correctly. Apologies if I got that wrong. But one light fleet carrier is on station, mainly off the west coast of Korea, supporting ground operations. The Fleet Air Arm aircraft were heavily involved in close air support. That's providing air support to ground operations. Another thing they were heavily involved in was interdiction, which was the military term for hitting North Korean supply lines and communications. The Fleet Air Arm played a heavy part in this. As well as the light carriers, and I should just say, when the Royal Navy couldn't step in with a light carrier, the Royal Australian Navy did so. But as well as the light carriers, other warships were on station, often one cruiser and 3 or 4 destroyers or frigates, including HMS Belfast and HMS Ceylon, for example. And these were used for everything from escorting routine duties to train busting. Now, train busting, if war can be considered glamorous, this was where they actually sailed close to the shore and used their main armament to take out North Korean trains. Again, it was thought at the time this was part of an effort to hinder North Korean communications and logistics network. If it wasn't being done by the air, then perhaps the Navy would get them too. The Royal Marines, an integral part of the Royal Navy, and they have a major role to play in the Korean War as well. At this time, the 1950s, we've got big ships like HMS Belfast, I mentioned, and HMS Ceylon and so on. And the Royal Marines are still serving on ships at this stage, doing things such as manning guns, and they have a traditional role aboard ship. Another role in Korea was the establishment of 4-1 Independent Commando Royal Marines, and this was a dedicated raiding force, putting in raids behind the lines on Korea, destroying railway lines, blowing up tunnels, that kind of thing. And also, if you've got a raiding force going in behind you, and you, from a North Korean perspective, that's going to tie down some of your troops and be a mental hindrance, if you like. So they were set up as a dedicated raiding force, and indeed they contributed a lot of raids. However, they'll always be remembered for their part in the Chosin Reservoir campaign. And this was the fighting right up in northeast North Korea in the depths of the winter of 1950, when Colonel Drysdale, their commanding officer, had them attached to 1st Marine Division, 1st United States Marine Division, and they fought in the epic Chosin Reservoir campaign, surrounded by thousands of Chinese in the depth of the North Korean winter. And as General Smith, the American Marine commander, said at the time, "Gentlemen, we are not withdrawing or retreating, we're advancing in a different direction." Which, if you think about it, if you're surrounded by thousands of Chinese troops in the depths of the North Korean winter, that is sort of true, actually. I'd like to mention air aspects as well. Now, I've mentioned the Fleet Air Arm. They were clearly heavily involved. The RAF was involved in the Korean War as well, although not perhaps as greatly as you might think. Sunderland flying boats like this one were doing maritime reconnaissance from bases in Japan. There were these AeroP flights. Now, what these were was aerial observation posts. There were dedicated army pilots flying light fixed-wing aircraft, and they were serviced by RAF ground crew. So this was a forerunner to the Army Air Corps, which didn't get established until 1957. RAF personnel were also seconded to the American Air Force. Famous names such as Air Vice Marshal Johnny Johnson and Air Vice Marshal Wickham Barnes to provide various expertise. And for example, about 20 pilots were seconded to the Americans flying the Sabre jets up in an area in northwest North Korea, if you can visualize it, called MiG Alley, where they took on the MiG-15 jets of the communists. And there were also RAF personnel serving with number 77 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force. Now, this was the first United Nations unit into Korea. It had been based in Japan. It was a dedicated ground attack squadron. It was flying the P-51 Mustang, so Second World War era kit, ground attack role. And during the war, it converts to the Gloucester Meteor, again in the ground attack role. So, having given an indication of Navy or naval and air aspects, I'd really like to turn my attentions to the Army now. And the British Army at this time is an interesting beast. It's composed of national servicemen, effectively conscripts, and as a result of the Korean War, national service was set at 2 years. There's also regulars, short service regulars, and there's recalled reservists, particularly in 29th Brigade in Korea. These were men who'd been, they'd done 7 years with the colours during the Second World War, then they had a 5-year reserve liability to serve, and many were recalled to serve in the British Army during the Korean War. As you can imagine, they weren't happy to do this. They're being wrenched out of civilian life. They've got families, they've got jobs, they're trying to settle down. They thought their military service was behind them. Potentially was a challenge for morale and discipline. On the plus side, from the Army's perspective, these men brought an abundance of experience. It was really, really helpful in 1950-51. Also, there were K volunteers, which may be less familiar with some of you, I don't know. Now, the K volunteers, this was a special 18-month engagement just to serve in Korea. So if you'd already been in the Army and served at least 18 months, you could sign on again for 18 months, especially to do Korea. Alternatively, if you were a national service officer or another rank who was eligible, you could sign on a regular engagement to do 18 months in Korea. The Army fought as independent brigades during the first year of the war, and then in the summer of 1951, it was instrumental in the formation of 1st Commonwealth Division. Now, I hope it's some use and of interest. I thought to give you an overview of the war from the perspective of the British Army in particular. So on the 25th of June 1950, North Korea invades the south. There's all those red arrows on the map. It pushes the South Korean and the American forces into what's called the Pusan perimeter. There's very, very bitter fighting. By September 1950, the Americans have lost something like 7,000 men. As this bitter fighting is going on, the UN calls for member states to furnish military assistance to South Korea. Now, the British send the 27th Infantry Brigade from Hong Kong, consisting of the 1st Battalions, the Middlesex Regiment, and Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. They were under strength, but they punched above their weight, if you like, and they fought in battles in the Pusan perimeter, and breaking out from the Pusan perimeter, as you can see on the map. Most famously at Hill 282, where the Argylls were napalmed by the American Air Force, with a lot of casualties on top of the casualties They're already suffering from being in action with the Koreans. As this fighting to break out of the Pusan perimeter is going on, General MacArthur launches his audacious Incheon landings, as we've heard before, that lead to the liberation of Seoul. So you effectively have sort of a hammer and anvil effect, the forces advancing out of the Pusan perimeter, going to meet those that have landed at Incheon and liberated Seoul, and thereby trapping the North Koreans. However, an important point to make is the North Koreans are not just fighting conventional warfare, they're fighting a concerted guerrilla warfare alongside their conventional warfare. 27th Brigade, having endured this bitter fighting in the Pusan perimeter and crossing the Nakton, they're airlifted to Kimpo, which was the airbase near Seoul. And then on the 5th of October, they're joined by a battalion from the Royal Australian Regiment, thus becoming a Commonwealth division. Also at this time, as you can see on the map, the decision was made by the Truman-led White House to cross the 38th parallel and take the war into North Korea. So we have the invasion of North Korea. Now, 27th Brigade played a major role. For example, they fought battles at Pakchon and Sarewan, and then you can see Pyongyang on the map, the North Korean capital. They were heavily involved in the liberation or the advance on Pyongyang. As they're in theatre and this is going on, 29th Brigade have been dispatched from the UK, originally to relieve 27th Brigade, but that doesn't occur for reasons which will become clear in a second. And 29th Brigade land at Pusan. They have this amazing rickety rail journeys up war-torn, war-ravaged Korea. They think initially they're going to be involved in anti-guerrilla operations. Indeed they are, but then they're eventually deployed near Pyongyang. Likewise, as this is going on, I mentioned the Royal Marine Commandos earlier, they're fighting their war up in northeast Korea as well. Now, the invasion of North Korea by the United Nations Command brings North Korea into the war, as we've seen. Brings Communist China into the war, as we've seen. And just in a nutshell, between October, November 1950 and January 1951, there were a series of offensives which result in pushing the United Nations Command's forces back to roughly the line of the River Han. Simultaneously, the forces that were fighting in northeast Korea, that's 10th Corps, including those Royal Marine Commandos, about 300 of them, they have to be evacuated by sea from places like Hungnam and Wonsan. Just very much trying to give you an overview. So the response to the Chinese offensives from the new commander on the ground, which is General Ridgway, American airborne commander, very, very capable general. He instigates a series of limited offences, basically to try and push fighting up to the line of the 38th parallel, roughly, as we saw in the previous talk. So those blue arrows on the map, he's pushing fighting up to roughly the line of the 38th parallel, limited offences, limited gaining ground. The idea was very much to inflict casualties on the enemy. It's what the troops called the meat grinder. It's using superior American firepower to inflict maximum casualties on Chinese and North Koreans. And we then have fighting solidifying roughly in the 38th parallel area. And then in April 1951, you have the famous Chinese Spring Offensive. That's those red arrows on the map. And this is where north of Seoul on the Imjin, 29th Brigade, and particularly 1st Battalion, the Gloucestershire Regiment, make their epic stand. Further to the east, at a place called Kapyong, the Canadians and Australians fight an equally epic battle, ably supported by 1st Battalion, the Middlesex Regiment. And by mid to late 1951, just to give you the overview, the fighting solidifying on the 38th parallel, and we're increasingly moving towards a static warfare where men are patrolling, they're holding static positions, they're going out on raids, and there's artillery duels and there's mortar duels. The fighting is, I'm being generalising here, is a little bit like the First World War. Obviously the terrain is vastly different, but it's men holding static positions and, as I say, raiding, patrolling, limited actions for key terrain features. If anyone wants me to elaborate on that, I can do at the end. Moving on. How do you get men to Korea? Well, if you're in places like Hong Kong, like 27th Brigade, that's not too bad. The Royal Navy can give you a quick hop across to Hong Kong. But if you're in the UK, for example, the main way these times was by the old trooper. And ships like this one, they weren't phased out until the 1960s. So for national servicemen and indeed all ranks, this was the way that you got to the Far East. Conditions aboard were pretty grim for other ranks. There was a strict divide between officers, NCOs, and other ranks. Officers and NCOs usually had quite good dining. They had a cabin to themselves. But if you were another rank, you'd be slumming it, as it were, on the troop decks. Bear in mind, people being seasick, it's hot and humid, it's very unpleasant. As I say, it probably wouldn't be tolerated today by today's standards. And if you're going out as a whole unit, say like the Gloucesters when they went out, or the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, or the Royal Ulster Rifles, there'd be a training programme aboard, you'd be firing weapons off the bow, you'd do PT, you'd have lectures, and the officers and NCOs will be doing their best to keep the men on their toes, because they know eventually 5-6 weeks later they're going to be arriving in Busan and they're going into a war zone. So what happens when they actually get to Korea? Well, at this time in the 1950s, and remember I'm talking about the 50s, I'm not talking about today, it is warfare in an undeveloped theatre. Diseases were rife. Just to give you two examples, malaria was a major concern and hemorrhagic fever. The climate's horrendous. Hot, dry, dusty, humid summers. For example, there was one soldier in the Dumb Light Infantry, and he just wore his shorts and his boots and nothing else. It was that hot when he was on duty. Conversely, you've got the Korean winter. It's one of the worst winters in the world. It's savagely cold. Writing in the British Army Journal, an officer from the Gloucesters describes how there's a wind that can convert men into disagreeable beasts. A wind so cold it can immobilize vehicles and equipment. Put it another way, it's so cold, if you touched bare metal with your hand, it would take all the skin off. The Korean winter really was horrendous, and that's something a lot of veterans always never forget. Another side to this is the poor communications in Korea, poor road system, poor rail system. It was all a hangover from the Japanese occupation of 1910 to 1945, so it was very dilapidated by 1950. So it was vital, the role of all the supporting arms in dealing with warfare in underdeveloped theatre. We heard about the Postal Service earlier, but it's also your Royal Engineers, your Royal Army Service Corps, Royal Signals, Royal Army Medical Corps, etc., etc. Absolutely vital role. Just take the engineers quickly, for example. They had to build roads, repair roads, bridging, all that kind of stuff was absolutely vital in Korea. I mentioned the Korean winter just quickly. This is kind of winter kit that the War Office did introduce by 1952, but the first winter of the war was appalling for a lot of the men. If you go to the National Army Museum, you can see the uniform worn by Corporal Don Barrett, and it was lucky that 27th Brigade, for example, were able to get equipment off the Americans because they went to Korea in jungle greens from Hong Kong. So to then have to face the Korean winter. But as I say, the War Office, in fairness to the War Office, it did introduce this purpose-built kit by the second winter of the war, which was meant to be an improvement. Relations with Koreans. Now, this is another big strand. It's something I'm trying to look at in my work at the minute. Particularly in 1950-51, refugees. Many soldiers in their memoirs, their oral histories, or when you talk to veterans, they share with you they were upset by the pitiful sight of refugees in 1950-51. There's another strand to this, and that is the guerrilla warfare the North Koreans are using. They are hiding in refugee columns. They hid their troops in refugee columns. So it was very difficult for, if you were holding a hill, holding a position, and you've got some friendly apparent friendly civilians coming towards you, they may in fact be Koreans, North Korean soldiers in disguise. part of the guerrilla warfare that the North Koreans were using. Friendly Koreans, I've put that there. What I mean by that is, for example, 1st Battalion, the Royal Ulster Rifles, adopted a number of orphans. So young lads, they looked after them, they clothed them, they fed them, and they performed various duties. As the war progresses, infantry battalions were being assigned 200 or 300 Korean porters. Now, these were men who were unfit in some way, too old or too young to serve in the South Korean military, and they were effectively performing as human mules, taking kit and supplies up and down the hills. And the perhaps an unsung area of the war, an underappreciated area of the war, but extremely valuable and improved the mobility of British units. Then something that came in quite near the end of the war, sort of we're talking March, April 53, is this CATCOMS. Forgive me, I can't pronounce it very well. Korean Augmentation Troops Commonwealth Division. And what this was South Korean soldiers who were trained soldiers were put in, embedded with British and Commonwealth units to try and boost manpower. It seems to have been relatively successful with the British, but I know that the Canadians found this quite problematic. Now, as you'll appreciate from what I've been saying about the conditions, what the soldiers had to put up with, the quote there is from Colonel Mitchell, who at the time of the Korean War was a captain with the Argylls. And this is Mad Mitch from Aden fame, for those of you interested. A lot of truth in that, really. In Korea, soldiers were tested to the limit. That's the picture on the right with the rifles and the Sten guns is of some Gloucesters. The left, apologies. And on the right, that's the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, I think. A hell of a lot of foot slogging in 1950-51. Equally, it's tough in late 51 onwards when you're holding static positions and going out patrolling and being mortared and suffering artillery bombardments and effectively risking your life every time you're on patrol, etc. Something I'm very interested in exploring in my work is combat capability and effectiveness. And just two quick examples to share with you, Korean-related. You'll notice the Gloucesters there, they're armed with the No. 4 Lee Enfield rifles, and then some of the men have got the Sten gun. The British Army was really short of automatic firepower, particularly in 50-51. This was a real challenge, given that you're dealing with an enemy that puts in mass attacks and uses a lot of night fighting, which is extremely unnerving, especially for young national servicemen who weren't used to it. Now, the Sten gun, I've yet to meet a soldier who has anything good to say about the Sten gun, really. It was a hopeless weapon, always jammed, not really much good. Soldiers always say they would have much preferred the Australian Owen gun, for example. And then the rifle. Now, the British Army, of course, prides itself on its musketry, and quite rightly, and the high standard of weapon training it generally gives to men. But the trouble with the rifle in Korea was it's a bolt-action rifle against an enemy that is not only often numerically superior at the point of attack, but is liberally armed with automatic weapons. So to give you an idea what I mean, there was one Gloucester regular soldier, and he said he was captured at the Imjin, writing in his memoirs and talking to me, he said using his rifle against a Chinese soldier armed with a submachine gun was akin to trying to spit in somebody's eye while you're being sprayed with a fire hose. So extremely tough for the infantry. But of course, it's not all about the infantry armours used in Korea. You might be surprised at that given the terrain. But tanks like the Centurion on the right in particular had a major part to play in providing infantry support. It had a 20-pounder main armament, and just to give you an idea of how accurate that was, I was privileged enough to know Sergeant Tom Noel of the Duke of Wellington's regiment. He's sadly no longer around, but he was a sniper sergeant with the battalion, and they were in Korea, and they were having trouble with a North Korean sniper absolutely dogging their position. They couldn't winkle him out. So they got on the phone or the radio, they called up a Centurion like this one from 1st Royal Tank Regiment, came along to where they were having the trouble, put out the North Korean sniper's position with one shot from the 20-pounder gun. It didn't even need a ranging shot, it was that accurate. So that's pretty impressive stuff. But there's another side to this. You see the tank on the left. That's a Cromwell Second World War era kit. There were a few of these used by 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars and elements of the Royal Artillery. And that one's been attacked by fanatical Chinese infantry with pole charges, actually leaping on the tank or going up close to the tank with an explosive charge and blowing the tracks off. And this was something that came as a great shock to many soldiers. Indeed, one of the sources I look at are battle experience questionnaires, and an officer who'd been at the Battle of the Imjin talked of the Chinese attacking tanks and what a shock it was for him. He hadn't expected that level of fanaticism and dedication. I'm going to say something about the artillery now. Artillery is, of course, used a lot in Korea. Increasingly more and more artillery as the war progresses. In 1950-51, like here, 25-pounder field gun. Finding positions was always a challenge, and crest clearance, actually getting shells up over the hill, was a challenge. But as the war progresses, all sides are using more artillery, so a corollary of that is the counter-bombardment effort. That is using your artillery to try and neutralise, or if not, knock out the enemy's artillery. Here are members of 61st Light Regiment Royal Artillery, and they're doing sound ranging. There's a good explanation of this in my book, but essentially what it is, they've surveyed in, so they know accurately the location of at least four microphones in no man's land, and these pick up the sounds of the enemy weapons being fired, and they measure that, which is what they're doing there, and then they use a derivation of the cosine formula and plotting these data on a grid and actually try and work out where the enemy gun or enemy mortar was. So, and this is an area of the war that a lot of national servicemen were involved in. As I say, there's one veteran, Alan Causer, who's sadly no longer here, but he contributed to my book, and you can read a much better explanation than he's much better qualified to give an explanation than I am. But sound ranging. I say something about the POW situation because, of course, tragically, so some men, they were captured, over 1,000 at least, mainly from the army. Famously, of course, the 500 plus members of the Gloucesters at the Battle of the Imjin, but there were many others as well. They endured horrendous marches, and bear in mind some of these men were already traumatised or wounded from being in combat. Marches up to prison camps on the North Korean Manchurian border. Now, North Korea and China were not subjected to they didn't respect the Geneva Convention, and the Chinese had what they called the lenient policy, which I always, I like the way the late Reverend Sam Davis used to explain this was the Chinese would say to the British POWs, and indeed other POWs as well, by rights, you as a tool of the imperialist West, by rights we should shoot you. We shouldn't spare you your life, but we are going to spare you your life, and we are going to re-educate you in the ways of Marxist-Leninism, the lenient policy. So these men were harangued daily, political lectures, having to do self-confession sessions, political interrogations, and indeed some, such as Colonel Khan of the Gloucesters, kept in isolated confinement. Others tortured, I mean, most famously General Farrah Hockley, and then Derek Kinney of the Northumberland Fusiliers as well. And so these men endured a terrible time. I know some of the POWs I've spoken to, they all said when they came back to the UK, they couldn't, they had to sleep on the floor. They couldn't sleep in a normal bed anymore. Sort of eating normal food again got you all right, and it got your weight up and so on, and sort of outwardly looking healthy, but inwardly you're carrying these deep mental scars. Now, just to round up, that's the ceasefire line in July 1953, which has been mentioned earlier, I know, in the two previous speakers. The Commonwealth Division there fighting north of Seoul. And then many national servicemen looked at this at the time, and they thought, what's it all about? Korea's finished, the Korean War's finished, and it's Korea's divided just like it was beforehand, so what was the point? But I think on reflection, many of them, of course, sadly passed away now, but can be rightly proud that they took part in the Korean War and saved South Korea, liberated South Korea, and saved South Korea from communism. And as it says on their medals, on the UN medal on the back, it says, in service in the defense of the Charter of the United Nations. That everyone had some medals like these. And just to round up, to finish off on casualties, to show you the casualty figures. 1,000, these are from the official history, General Farrar-Hockley's official history. So 1,078 total deaths. That's died of wounds, died in action, died in accidents, etc. Total wounded, 2,674. And just worth bearing in mind, when I say wounded, that's severely wounded in many cases, losing an arm or a leg on mines, or being raked by Chinese machine gun fire and having severe abdominal wounds. I hope that summary's been of interest and been useful, the overview. If anybody is interested, I do have copies of my book available, which discusses in more detail about the experiences of British and American soldiers during the Korean War. And I've also brought these medals in, which if anyone wants to have a look, the British Korean War medal and the UN medal. I got these from the medal shop in Hexham for instructional purposes. So thank you very much. I hope that's been useful.
I'd like to thank you very much indeed, James. Again, a fascinating, more informational-filled explanation of the British involvement. As we're running a little bit ahead of time, there's an opportunity for a Q&A. If there are any questions from the floor, please fire away.
Yeah, one observation, if I may, former Ambassador Rory Morris. I don't think anyone mentioned it, but this was the first engagement that the UN, then newly formed, actually got involved in, which is, I think, worth remembering very early on in the UN's life. Also, there continued to be in Seoul, based in the US military compound, a platoon of British soldiers until the early 90s, the early 1990s. It was rotated from Hong Kong regularly. It had an officer in charge, a young officer. They took part in honor guard ceremonies on the US base, alongside some other nationalities, Thais and various others. It was only in the early 90s, when I was back in the Foreign Office in London, we realised that with the handover of Hong Kong coming up, there could be this continued sort of rotation of forces. So I was involved in winding that up. But it did mean there was a Commonwealth liaison mission in Seoul, a sort of vestige of the war, on the US Army base until the early 90s, and they had their own little compound within the US Forces compound. But thank you, both of those presentations are fascinating.
That's very interesting, thank you, Adam.
Okay, John was first. John, the microphone is on. There hasn't been any mention today to the supervisory committees that were formed after the war, and the fact that in the case of Sweden, and I think it's Switzerland, they're still operating on behalf of the United Nations. Would you like to comment at all?
I don't know whether I have much very useful to add on that. It immediately made me think of a fantastic South Korean film, which people may have seen, called JSA, which plays around with this whole thing of the supervisory commission and sort of in a bit of a kind of what-if situation, set in Panmunjom. But I don't know that much about what the Supervisory Commission do now. I do know that they used to have, 2 members also from sort of Eastern Bloc as well, I think, didn't they? Was it Czechoslovakia? Poland, yeah, right. And they sort of abdicated at some point their responsibility as part of that Supervisory Commission. But the Swedish and the Swiss still continue. I have at some stage seen a short documentary, I think, about what was it the Swedish one? What the kind of chief there did in his daily activities. But it is a curious idea of what are their actual responsibilities on a day-to-day basis. Right.
I think what characterised it was an absolute nightmare. In that you had the 2 camps, the West and the East, and in North Korea particularly, the Poles and the Czechs went out of their way to prevent any inspections by the Swiss and the Swedes. So basically the Swiss and the Swedes just collected stamps because there was nothing much else that they could do. They were effectively confined to their inspection teams, which went nowhere, weren't allowed to go particularly anywhere. And then you get in some of the letters from the Czechs particularly, who were stationed in South Korea and continuously at the pointed end when it came to the South Koreans' attitude towards them, is you get letters where they would turn around and say, "Thank goodness, I just crossed back into North Korea. I can relax now." And it was a sort of like a microcosm of the Cold War, basically, essentially.
I think it also highlights very well the frozen nature of the Korean War, and the way in which things have, 75 years, well, it's not 75 years since the Armistice, but, with that far down the road in history, and yet some things have just stayed exactly the same for all that whole period, and it's shocking. And I mentioned it in my lecture, but one of the things I find the most shocking is that, these things like the Supervisory Commission or other kinds of bodies should have found ways to facilitate some kind of better, meetings between North and South Koreans. And I'm sure there are all kinds of reasons, and probably mainly on the North Korean side, why that didn't happen. But I find that the biggest tragedy, I think, ongoing tragedy of the war.
Grace, would you like to be the next question? Or come to the other?
Thank you. Well, it maybe my question links to what you've just said, because Dr. Owen, you did show us the Armistice, which obviously ends the fighting, but there was no peace treaty. And from everything that's been said, it suggests that there was never really a settlement. And you're also saying maybe there could have been better meetings. I mean, is that right? It's just there was no peace treaty because the fighting ended, but nothing was really resolved? Or is there any other explanation? Thank you.
Yes, nothing was resolved. I mean, there have been, on many occasions, there have been talks of there being a peace treaty. Whether that's a peace treaty between... See, this is where it gets complicated. Who should the peace treaty be between? Should that be a peace treaty between the US and North Korea? Now, that has been openly mentioned and discussed in the last, say, 10 years. When Trump was in his first period in office, that was being touted as a possibility. There was one point where it seemed to be almost quite close. Or should it be a peace treaty between North and South Korea? I mean, the Armistice is not between North and South Korea anyway. It's between the UN command on one side and the Chinese and the North Koreans on the other side. The South Koreans are not in the Armistice. So, I mean, you could have potentially, there could be, and perhaps there should be a peace treaty between North and South Korea. But, I mean, there are all kinds of problems with that as well, because both North and South Korea ultimately believe the country should be reunified as a single country. So to have a peace treaty between the two Koreas would be quite strange, because it sort of goes against that idea. Things are perhaps changing on that front. Kim Jong-un, the current leader of North Korea, has sort of changed the stance of North Korea about reunification in certain ways, but essentially having a peace treaty between North and South is quite an odd idea. And so, yeah, I don't know where it's going to come. I think that what is most possible is perhaps some kind of agreement between the US and North Korea. What shape that would take, I have no idea. Just one other point. I believe that between South Korea and China, interestingly, do have some kind of agreement over. I'm not sure what the text is or what exactly happened, but in 1991 I or II, they formed diplomatic relations, and they sort of settled their scores on the on the Korean War. That's the PRC and ROK. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I really enjoyed all the lectures this morning. With regards to the first lecture, where we talk about what kind of war it is, it's always struck me as rather odd that we look at the Korean War in isolation to broader geopolitical, historical, longue durée trends of the period. Is there perhaps yet another one to add to your list of looking at it? You know, you could argue the roots of this go right the way back to the forced opening of East Asia, post kind of Treaty of Nanjing, then the opening of Japan, and then of course Korea. And the North Korean War marks a kind of a transition, really, but one that isn't resolved. What strikes me, I mean, for example, you talk about the North and the South, you know, the industrialized North, where Japan's kind of semi-annexed it into the Manchurian heartlands and the heavy industry, with the South producing the agriculture. Do you think that looking at it solely as a Cold War conflict or as a national conflict rather than a broader historical geopolitical pattern has limitations?
I think that's for me. That's a very sophisticated and complicated question to get into. Thank you, because it's made me think. I mean, yes, I think other historians, I mean, I mentioned and I showed Bruce Cummings' book on one of the slides here. You know, he himself has argued that the roots lie more, as much as anything, in the colonial period and grow out of the colonial period. So it's not just a Cold War conflict. It can't just be reduced to that. It's about you know, a country trying to find its identity and form in a post-colonial period. But unfortunately, as we know, it wasn't really able to do that independently. It did that while being shaped by two opposing superpowers. So yes, I think you can take it back earlier, and I think it is related to colonialism, Japan's colonialism in East Asia, but also the longer history of European colonial interference in East Asia as well. So, yeah, I mean, we can go, as I said at the beginning of my lecture, we could go back and back and back to look at where the origins of this are. I decided to sort of limit it to 1945.
Hi, I might be the only Korean here, and actually, it could be related to the other person's question. And I'm really glad that you pointed out that how we see could be divided. Like it can be, Koreans could see war of freedom, not war of, you know, different how you see, or war of independence, not decolonization. So I'm really glad that you brought it up, because it's a little bit related to your question, like how Westerns or other countries see what the Korean War is. Actually, how we see is we just try to find more of independence and then freedom as well. But sometimes it's very sad how it's shown from other people's perspective through the books or through the politics. And so I'm very happy about that. So it's actually maybe slightly related to your question, so I don't know if I'm talking about it a bit too much, but because Korea, South Korea, North Korea, some people, even Koreans maybe think differently. Some people, in my case, I think we are the one country, and someone mentioned that it's still, we are on the truth. So it's on the peace, you know, we are on the peace, but of course, because of the North Korea what's happening here, it's not really helpful at the moment. So could you please just a little bit maybe speak up about like how you see it might go a bit further, and then how Koreans usually maybe might translate or interpret this type of our approach here?
Thanks for that. I think you're asking me to kind of speculate on what might happen in the future, and I often get asked these kind of questions and slightly dread these questions, because academics making predictions about the future usually tend to end up being wrong. it's very difficult. I've been watching what's happened what's been happening between relations between North and South Korea for like the last 25 to 30 years, I think, and it always seems to be sort of, I don't know, one step forward and two steps back. Maybe it seems to be what it is a lot of the time. I feel that these days I'm not a Korean citizen. I'm not ethnically Korean. I think you can see that pretty easily. I care a lot about Korea, but I don't sort of have a stake in it in quite the same way, and I don't have quite the same emotional stake or attachment to the idea of the unification of Korea, I suppose. What my sort of minimal hope is really just a peaceful coexistence between the two Koreas, establishing some kind of stable basis for them to have some kind of peaceful coexistence. Even that I think quite modest ambition seems a long way off, to be absolutely honest about it, sadly. But that's what I would personally most hope for. And then perhaps once you've got to that stage, you can think about other things like what is the longer term future. But that's of course not taking into account all kinds of unforeseen events, such as, for example, a collapse of the regime in North Korea, which may or may not happen, but people have been predicting it for decades and it has not happened. So I'm not going to predict it.
Thank you. Thank you for those presentations. So I'm one of a trio of former British ambassadors to Korea. I'm the one that served most recently up until 2018. And just a couple of comments, if I may. One point that wasn't made, but might be of interest to people, maybe not on the detail, is the reason why the Chinese voted for intervention in Korea. That was, of course, because at the time the seat in the UN was occupied by nationalist China. And just I did visit Pyongyang while I was ambassador in Seoul, and I visited the War Museum as you did. And I remember being given that presentation at the beginning about how the Americans and the South Koreans had basically started the war. And I said, well, we're British, so where does that put us? And the guy turned around and said, well, you were simply a satellite of the imperialist aggressors, which cleared that one up for me. But just another observation on the sort of Chinese perspective on the war. I had a very interesting meeting in Pyongyang with the Chinese ambassador, and I told him about the veterans reunion that I just attended in Seoul, and he went on to tell me about the importance of Chinese veterans of the war. And one question that people often ask is, why is China so supportive of North Korea? And one of the reasons is because there's such actually a political pressure from veterans, and of course Chairman Mao's son was killed during the war, and that's something I think that's not widely understood.
Thank you for a fascinating background and observations. I'm one of the Americans here. I was just wondering if you'd expand on why MacArthur was asked not to go farther north as he began his recapture of that territory, and what value or impact the threat of nuclear weapons may have had on some of those decisions. Thank you.
Would you like to answer this one? The great fear of Truman was that the war would escalate. The nuclear option would be an escalation. As I understand it, it really was imperative to try and keep it contained on the Korean peninsula, if at all possible. And then militarily linked to the politics of it, when the 8th Army, American 8th Army, with the British forces I was mentioning and many others, when they go into North Korea, they split themselves. You had 10th Corps up in northeast Korea and then 8th Army. So that invited the great Chinese ambush and the Chinese intervention of October 1950, and it lent itself to Chinese attack. And they had they not put out via the Indian government the warning that China had said, we will become involved if you cross the 38th parallel and if you advance into North Korea. So does that answer some of your question?
Richard, we've got time for one more question, I think.
I get why China intervened. I could see it would see what that advance, the Allied advance into North would be seen as an existential threat, particularly given the Japanese using Korea as a bridge into China with the Kwangtung Army. I suppose it's a bit, adding to that speculation, I mean, I see it as a problem that's going to inevitably, it's not going to get better, it's going to get worse. I just wonder what your thoughts were on the impact of the Ukrainian war. And, you know, the West seemed to be mistakenly viewing Russia as a European power rather than a Eurasian power. So all of a sudden there's like billions of pounds or dollars being reinvested back into kind of North Korea for arms and weapons. We've effectively isolated China. You know, Iran, you've got the potentials there, we're not careful of a really, really large geopolitical bloc that could actually create more instability. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm not going to say much. Just to say, you know, I've been watching the last few years and North Korea's renewed engagement with Russia, you know, with, I'm trying to think of the right word, interest, shall we say? I mean, it's a very, you know, it is a very dangerous situation, this new alignment. I guess one thing I would just add to that, which I think is interesting for people who watch sort of North Korea and its international relations, is what it means for this quite strange and awkward three-way relationship between North Korea, China, and Russia, which has been there since the 1950s, right? This kind of three-way relationship between the three countries, and North Korea was very successful at using that relationship to maximize its gains from both of its sort of big power backers, and it's now re-engaging in that kind of activity again, but particularly with the Russians, which from what I hear is enormously annoying to the Chinese. But we will see where that goes. I don't know. You know, one way or another, the North Koreans do know the sort of advantages that they have and the way that they can make them work for them with regard to both those countries.
I think I'd just briefly add to that about the former ambassadors in this room and their expertise, but we're living in very dangerous times with this divide between China, North Korea, and the polarization between the lack of leadership we have in the United States and China on the other hand. So interesting times, but very dangerous as well.
Yes, oh, thank you. I am on, yes. Thank you very much for a very interesting Q&A session, which I very much appreciate. We are coming up to the break, and this afternoon, obviously, we move into the slightly more familiar area, certainly for this particular building, of the postal history and philatelic side of things. And if the historians and academics and diplomats are going to hang around for that, there may be something of that they can find some connection with. And also, please don't forget, we have what is possibly the largest display of primarily postal history related to Korea and the Korean War that's been shown outside of Korea. So that's well worth having a look. And in fact, quite a lot of the key actions and events of the war actually reflected at obviously a much lower level in bits of paper, right, and letters and things that are the sort of personal connection with the people who were on the ground and certainly involved in so much of the things that we talk about from a distance, you know, from in terms of our experience. And it's there, which is part of the interest for us non-academics.